Okay, hello everyone. We will start at 7:30. That's 9 minutes from now. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the last edition of our workshop for this PD workshop part 2. Before we start, we would like to give a few reminders for everybody watching the stream on YouTube. Please respect the rules of equity in the live chat. If you have any questions, please course them through there and we will forward them to our speaker immediately. Please expect a bit of stream delay to account for the transmission of the data. So, without further ado, I will pass the mic on to our speaker. They may introduce themselves.
Okay. Hello. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rene, and this evening I will be talking about extensions. This is not extension in general, as in the idea of extending a case, although this is also something that will be incorporated as we go about the discussion. But we're talking about extension, specifically the member speakers. Um, a couple of things that I would like to say before we formally get into the discussion of this. Uh, Extensions and member speeches are actually quite interesting in the sense that compared to other speaking positions like that of a prime minister, a leader of opposition, or the whips, the structure and the template for what constitutes an extension speech is less rigid and allows so much room for creativity and allows so much room for you to be flexible and do it in whichever way that you feel comfortable in. But that being said, there are a couple of things that needs to be remembered when you're delivering a member's speech. That's the first one. Second, this is by no means an imposition as to how you're supposed to deliver your extension speeches. These are just some thoughts that I have from my years of experience, both debating and adjudicating, as to what I notice works. And what I notice doesn't work. So, hopefully, this will help you in improving your ability to deliver an extension speech. Um, if you have any questions, do not hesitate to type in your questions, and I'm going to go over them. And if it's something that is related to what I'm supposed to talk about, I will try to address them as I go along. So, that being said, allow me to show you what we will be covering in this evening's discussion. So, when we talk about extensions in British parliamentary debating, there are three things that I would want us to discuss. The first would be little less known secrets to succeeding in extending. Some of you may have already known these things. Some of you probably do not know these things. For those of you that are already aware of these things, hopefully this will serve as a refresher and an affirmation of what you already know. And for those of you that are not yet aware of them, hopefully this helps you in the process. Next one, we'll talk about the different types of extensions. So hopefully this will facilitate your crafting of your speeches during your prep time and even within the debate itself. And lastly, now that you're aware of the different types of extensions, we'll just quickly go over how then do you execute what you already know. So, that being said, let's talk about the different things that will be covered today. So, the first thing I'd want to say when it comes to succeeding in becoming a better member speaker is to realize that the first step in your success begins way before an actual tournament. And I know that this applies in debate in general, but when it comes to becoming a more efficient and effective member speaker, it's not something that will arrive the day of the tournament itself. It's not something that will fall on your head on the tournament day itself. It's something that you build over time. Think of it as exercising. I know it sounds ironic coming from me, but think of it as exercising in the sense that the more that you do it, the more it becomes second nature. So there are a couple of things that you need to think about if you want to do better as an extension speaker. The first of which is um, because it allows so much room for creativity and flexibility. There are different ways in which people have successfully done an extension. So one of the things that you can do um, prior to a tournament, supposing that you're going to be the member in your team, is to watch different videos of different speakers that you think have succeeded in delivering their member speeches. And then one of the things that you can do is try not only copying what they say, because this is something that I notice is common to a lot of newer and intermediate debaters. Instead of copying what a successful debater says in his or her speech or their speech, try to understand the structure behind the speech, understand the internal logic and how they deliver their members' speeches, understand the implicit and explicit strategy that they employ. And then after doing that, try applying it to your personal speeches. And along the way, try to personalize it. If something works, then continue doing that. If something doesn't, then tweak it a bit so it becomes a little more comfortable with you. So that's one of the things that you can do. Apart from that, your ability to extend, especially in close rounds where opening teams are doing quite well, is based on the way that you're able to think outside the box, and the way that you're able to build that skill is through matter loading. So I know that one of the earlier sessions that were covered this week is about matter loading. So you also need to employ that when it comes to building your skill as an extension speaker, because the more that you matter load, the more that it expands the different perspectives that you have, your ability to understand nuances, your ability to um, break apart large ideas into smaller fragments and smaller pieces that allows you to have an entry point to develop a full extension, either something that is completely new that have not been discussed by the opening teams, or something that you can extend from the material that you've already heard coming from the opening teams. Um, Apart from that, one of the things as well that is important to take note of is, if you pay attention to a lot of the speakers that are successful in debating and successful in the craft of debating, one thing that is common to all of them is that sense of deliberateness. Notice that everything that they're saying serves a particular purpose, and that deliberateness comes from a mastery of the fundamentals, the mastery of the basics, their ability to have a strong sense of rationale for why they're saying what they're saying, and understanding why they need to say it at that particular point in time, is a reflection of them being masters of the basic, but at the same time employing strategies to elevate their material from the basics. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the more you practice and the more that you prepare prior to a tournament, the more confident you are in your skills uh, leading to an actual tournament, which means that when you see a motion and you probably don't understand it, or when you're in a round where you have more experienced debaters as opening, you're not going to panic and you're not going to feel scared that you're required to extend from what they're delivering. So a lot of the things that will determine your success as an extension speaker begins way before an actual tournament. Now, one of the other things that I've realized that's very, very helpful when it comes to building your skill as an extension speaker, not just an extension speaker, but any other speaker in general, if you want to be better, you need to have an experience in adjudication. It may not necessarily require you to be a competitive adjudicator, meaning you go into a tournament and register as a judge. Uh, but that will also help. But your ability to understand the debate from an adjudicator's point of view gives you a special advantage. One of the first things that you can think about, especially when you're trying to extend, is to put on an adjudicator's hat and ask yourself, if this is already in the deliberation, which judges just have a very limited time to talk to each other and assess your case, they probably would spend around 15 to 20 minutes going over their notes, deliberating with each other, and discussing the merits of each other's cases. So you need to ask yourself, when it comes to the point of discussing the opening exchange, what are the things that these judges are likely to say about opening government's team, opening opposition's team, the opening exchange in general? And what do you think the judges will consider that will either decide that they would award the win to those teams, or that these judges will take against those teams? Your ability to have an understanding of these things also um, gives you an advantage in terms of what you can contribute as an extension. So never underestimate the importance and power of an adjudication. But apart from that, one of the things as well that you can incorporate when you're delivering your extension speech is to assess the debate that happened so far in the opening exchange in a language that is somewhat similar to that of the adjudicator. So, for example, if you feel that the opening exchange um, lacked a certain clarity in terms of, say, for example, mutually exclusive points, then that's something that you can incorporate in your extension and then explain to the judges why that is an important consideration when it comes to the evaluation of the debate and in the deliberation process. So these are things that are also important. But at the same time, being an adjudicator or having an experience as an adjudicator also heightens your ability to feel the rhythm of the debate. What do I mean by this? Because debates are dynamic, it's important for you to feel the direction by which the debate evolves. So at a point in time that you're supposed to deliver your extension speech, you need to feel how the debate is progressing at that point in time, which means that you might deprioritize some arguments that you initially thought of. You need to bump up some responses because that's what the debate is calling for at that point in time, or you may need to shift your strategy completely based on what's lacking in the opening teams. And these are skills that you learn or you acquire as an adjudicator. But at the same time, because adjudicators are asked to assess the debate as an objective and average reasonable voter, it's also important that you have an idea what these people do in the deliberation, because the kind of language that they use in the deliberation and the factors that they consider are things that an average reasonable voter uh, would also consider when they're listening to these speeches. So these are important things to consider in terms of either pushing the argument a little further so that it comes to a point where it's super clear, or scaling it down because it's going a little too far and it's no longer hitting the mark. Um, Additionally, your experience as an adjudicator um, also gives you an idea when a particular speaker is doing well, not necessarily because of the content of their speech. Because if you look back in several speeches of people that have either won that round or have won a tournament, for example, looking back, the speeches that they've delivered didn't necessarily have the best content in it, but there is something in the way that they delivered that speech that resonated to the judges. And it's important for you to consider that the material that you're going to deliver in your speeches will probably stay in these judges' minds, like for a maximum of an hour or 2 hours, assuming that the deliberation took a longer time. But beyond that, these things would no longer register in their mind. So you need to create an imprint in the judges' minds that will remain relevant for that time period. So it's important for you to have a mindset of an adjudicator as well, if you want to to be better as an extension speaker. Next one, uh, it's very important that as an extension speaker, you listen with an intention to understand. What do I mean by this? Listening is an underrated skill when it comes to debating, because oftentimes um, teams will hear sound bites that they probably have heard in another debate or a motion that is similarly worded. The thing about it is that um, just because they have the same label, or just because they sound reminiscent, doesn't mean that it's the same debate. One important thing to take note of is you need to approach debates as if it's the first time. Um, Even when you're reading the motion, while it's very common for us to associate the motion to a prior debate that we've debated in the past, or a prior debate that we've witnessed in the past, it's important to approach the debate with with fresh eyes, in order for you to be present uh, in that debate itself. It's also important because even if the motion seems similar, there might be new nuances to them that creates an entirely different debate. So, say for example, we've seen so many debates that asks us to evaluate whether or not X person is a good representation of this particular minority group. So, say for example, when at that time when Miley Cyrus shed off her Disney persona, one of the things that people were asking is she a good representation of the feminist movement? So there had been so many motions that are worded different, that were worded similarly. The only difference is they substituted Miley Cyrus from another to another person like Kim Kardashian, Paris Hilton, etc. Now, each of these motions probably would utilize an archetype of a female celebrity that doesn't necessarily represent a traditional concept of what being a woman is. They may have their rebellious streak. They may have something about them that makes people question and not treat them as seriously. But each of these motions are different from each other, and they're not necessarily the same. So you need to pay attention to what is happening um, in the debate, and not just listen so you can pick up sound bites, but also to listen to understand how they're saying it. Uh, what do I mean by this? Um, it's important for you to understand that teams have a particular strategy that they are employing. Teams have conscious decisions that they're incorporating when they're delivering their speeches. When you listen with an intention to understand, these things come to light a little better. You'll have a better sense of the direction that they want to take their case to. So it's easier for you to call them out and say, look, this is what you promised your goal was, but the way that you ran your entire case doesn't support that particular goal. So we question whether or not there really is a good basis for us to believe your initial claim that promises these particular goals. So it's important for you to um, listen with an intention to understand. But apart from that, it's also important for you to pay attention, because one of the things that I'm seeing lately as a trend when it comes to closing speakers is the crafting of the delineation from their opening teams. Sometimes I see teams that would say our opening teams lacked A, B, C, D, E. But if they were just listening intently to what their opening teams were saying, they would know that their understanding of what the opening teams lack isn't as accurate as they understood it to be. And it's very important because these things affect your overall persuasiveness. So if judges who are paying more attention to you as a closing speaker pick up that what you are actually saying isn't accurate, or that it seemed as if you're misrepresenting your opening teams, they're less likely to believe everything else that you're saying. Plus, it makes it easier then for your opening teams to call you out and say, look, you're misrepresenting us, or you're not understanding our case. Either way, it's not going to result to your favor, because even if you win that round, you're less likely going to get good scores because you misunderstood or you failed to listen to some important elements that you should have been paying attention to. Now, next one. One important skill that extension speakers need to have is their ability to describe what's happening in the debate with as much efficiency and specificity. What does this mean? What this means is that as an extension speaker, you have a unique perspective in the debate that opening teams don't necessarily have. And that is seeing an opening team debate and seeing that debate develop and evolve at the opening exchange, which means that from your perspective, you can take a step back and view the debate from a bird's eye view and make an assessment what exactly is going on here. Just to illustrate this point, it's very common to hear extension speakers say there's a deadlock in opening teams because they failed to adequately characterize the different stakeholders in the debate. Or, for instance, they will say opening teams only talked about this and failed to consider the impacts of these things. Now, while that may be true, the more specific you are in describing these things in as efficient manner possible, the better your position is in the debate. The reason why that's the case is because one, you're giving clarity to what's already happening, what's already happened in the debate. So judges will reward you for that because obviously you're helping them with their job by making it easier for them. But at the same time, it also signals to the judges that you have a thorough understanding of what's happening in the opening exchange thus far, and gives a very accurate description of where you are entering in your extension. So you need to be as descriptive as possible of what's happening in the opening teams, but you also need to make sure that it's done in the most efficient way possible. Otherwise, you're going to run out of time to talk about your actual extension. So again, instead of saying there's a deadlock in the opening teams because they failed to consider A, B, C, D, E, you extend that idea by explaining to the judges what the implication is of opening teams failing to deliver those things. So, what does it mean for the opening teams to fail in terms of considering A, B, C, D, E? How does that affect their individual cases? But overall, how does that affect their how does that result to the deadlock that you promised? And more importantly, judges will reward you if the next thing that you will do is resolve that deadlock. And it's going to be much easier for the judges to follow your logic if they're able to see you describe first and foremost how we arrived at that situation. So this is something that's only exclusive in the closing teams, because obviously opening teams will not have access to this vantage point. And I think this is underrated. You need to harness the full potential of being given this opportunity as a closing team. So one of the other things that I also want to emphasize is that as an extension speaker, you need to make sure that when you extend clean, meaning you do not misrepresent, you do not extend from a caricature version of the opening debate that happened thus far, or you do not create a caricature based on the last speaker's speech and make the entire extension based on that. The reason behind that is because you're essentially um, your entry point in the debate are what we call low hanging fruits, meaning in terms of the rigor of analysis that it requires for you to respond to them, it doesn't illustrate as much skill, it doesn't illustrate as much logical capacity on your end when you're targeting them at their worst. But at the same time, if judges are able to see that there are better contribution that happened in the opening exchange that you weren't adequately responding to because you're either misrepresenting them or you're responding only to the worst version of their case, then you will definitely not going to be rewarded um, by the judges. But at the same time, when you take their case as is and take them in their best version, it also forces you to elevate the material that you have. So, as opposed to responding to the caricature of their case, you can actually start extending by saying, this was the intention of their case. Unfortunately, they failed to deliver that because of A, B, C, D, E. And then allow me then to illustrate to you what happens even if they were able to achieve the intention of the argument that they have. The reason why this is important is because oftentimes we respond to teams based on how we understood their case. However, oftentimes when teams decide that this is a material that I will incorporate in my case, or this is a material that I will be delivering, there is a rationale behind it. So you need to understand what their intention is, because sometimes they may have a problem with their manner, they may have a problem with their delivery, but if the intention of that argument is a transcends and the judges were able to pick that up, then you're essentially not directly responding to the argument, and that puts you in a disadvantage because in the overall assessment, when the judges evaluate you based on your engagement, you're less likely going to receive favorable remarks from your judges. So extend clean, do not misrepresent, and do not extend from a caricature version of the debate that happened thus far. Also, do not misrepresent teams. While it's important for teams to create a distinction based on what was given by their opening team vis-a-vis what they're bringing in as new material into the debate, it's important that um, you do so honestly, and don't lie and say that, well, opening teams didn't do this or opening teams failed in doing X stuff, even if they actually did. So make sure that you do not do that. Next one, understand that cases that teams launch have their own internal logic, structures, and strategies. What do I mean by this? Um, what I mean by this is that when you try to listen and understand to a team's case, it's important for you to not only pay attention to what is being said, but also understand the underlying strategies, internal logic, and the structure that underpins the things that are being said explicitly. That way, you'll have a better insight into the thought process that the teams employed when they were deliberating and when they were prepping for their case. But at the same time, it gives you a better idea as to how to either uh, push that material to its fullest extent, supposing the team failed to do so, or it's easier then for you to approximate extents and likelihoods, because this is something that often decides which team is going to win in a debate. If you're able to prove better likelihood, if you're able to prove um, better extents, then you're likely to win that particular debate. So one way of doing that is by being able to have an understanding of the internal logic, the strategies that are employed, and the inherent structure of the teams speaking before you. So you need to understand these things. So all in all, there are a lot of things that happens within the debate that are not explicitly being said by the speakers, but also gives you but you also need to pay attention to in order for you to be more effective in the delivery of your extension. So those are some of the things that I think are going to be very helpful when you're just starting out or wanting to improve your skills as an extension speaker. So now we will proceed to the next part of the debate. The next thing that we will talk about will be creating that right mindset. What do we do now that we've drawn um, extension in the debate? So the first thing that you need to do is to realize something that is unique to extension speakers that no other team in the opening half of the debate have. And that is, technically, compared to them, you have more than half an hour to come up with an extension. So one of the things that I see with newer teams is that when they're in a round and the opening teams are more experienced, they tend to panic. And naturally, when you panic, your ability to really think things through properly and to do the things that I mentioned earlier, that is, pay attention, listen with an intention to understand. Do not just listen to what is being said explicitly, but also understand the underlying strategies that are being employed based on what are being said, or being able to take a step back, uh, give a bird's eye view of the debate, and assess what's happening in the debate in the most descriptive fashion possible. Your ability to do these things will be hindered or will be limited if you're already panicking just because your opening teams are stellar debaters. And naturally, one of the things that will trigger this is probably when they're delivering their opening speeches. A lot of the things that they're covering are things as well that you have included in your prep time. So you start crashing out things, but that is not a cause of panic, because even when they talk about everything that you've come up with so far, realize that these speakers only have, as a collective, 14 minutes together, which means that they will not be able to comprehensively cover every single thing that needs to be said about that particular motion. Now, again, this is based on the assumption that the motion is fair, that the motion is um, balanced for all the teams in the debate. It has sufficient breadth and depth that allows you to really come up with something that's unique and something that is new to the table. So if that's the case, then there really isn't any reason for you to panic. So that's the first one. Second one, I think this is also very important. You need to genuinely show generosity to the other teams and a humble acceptance that you have to defend a trade off. And oftentimes, I notice that teams would do this as a lip service. What do I mean by this? uh, it's very common to hear debaters say, "Oh, we will be generous to this team," and assume that this is what they're saying. But if you listen to what they're actually saying, that's not generosity at all. That's them shitting on that team. And I don't think that that's healthy. I don't think that that pushes the uh, envelope of the healthy discourse that happens in that debate. I understand why teams would probably do that because obviously that illustrates that they're superior compared to that team. But as a collective, the debate suffers. So when you approach the debate, extend genuine generosity to the other teams. I think one important thing for you to remember is that debaters are generally some of the most intelligent people uh, in their universities. While this may be an assumption, I think in general, uh, there's some truth to that. Meaning, these individuals will probably say at least one or two things that are sensible, one or two things that are logical, one or two things that do make sense. So if you do not extend genuine generosity to these teams, you're less likely to listen to them intently. You're less likely to understand them based on the intention that they have when they're running a case, and you're probably just going to um, get ahead of yourself and say, "Ah, okay, so this is what they're trying to argue," even if that is not the intention of the speaker or the teams. It's also less likely for you to pay attention to the strategies that they're employing when they're delivering their speeches. So you need to genuinely believe that these teams um, have some capacity for running good arguments. And when they do, you do need to acknowledge that. The reason behind that is that judges evaluate when judges evaluate the debate, they're going to look into these things. So if you're able to respond to the debate that talks about the best material that your opening teams have or a particular speaker delivered in the debate, if you're able to successfully respond to those things, if you're successfully able to acknowledge and engage that aspect of the debate, then you're more likely going to be rewarded with higher speaker scores, and your team is more likely going to be factored in when the judges evaluate everyone in terms of engagement. But at the same time, you also need to acknowledge that you have to defend a trade off. The assumption behind this is that AdScore decides to come up with motions with an understanding that there needs to be fairness, that all teams are likely to have access to the same material and the same extent of logic when it comes to what they can put to the discussion in relation to the motion. That being the case, um, teams that never acknowledge that they have to defend a trade off are always at a disadvantage. And this includes teams or speakers that will say, "Oh, we are then going to defend our worst case, or we're willing to defend the trade off." But in reality, and if you look into the speeches that they're delivering, they're actually not defending any trade off. They're not defending the worst case. They're defending a close to the worst case, but not the worst case itself. So there needs to be some extent of actual trade off that you are going to defend, because that creates a distinction between what you are defending and what the other side is defending. And if judges are unable to see the distinction between these things, it's much harder for the judges then to make a clear cut distinction between your team and the other side, meaning it's going to be much harder for the judges to be convinced of what you're delivering in your member speech. But in addition to that, if you have this as a mindset entering the round, you're also going to be more aware of things that you need to preempt. Because if you're able to embody a mindset that extends generosity to the other side, you're more likely to access what the best case or cases are for the other side, which means that your ability to preempt those things is also going to significantly be improved. At the same time, because you're also accepting the trade off that you have to defend, you're more likely to come up with uh, responses as well, supposing the other side brings those things up. So, this is something that you can consider um, actively thinking about when you're an extension speaker, because oftentimes in opening exchange, they want to draw as much distinction from each other as possible. And the effect of that is that one team accuses the other of not being engaging or not defending a trade off, but in reality, neither of them are actually. Or both of them are actually guilty of doing what they're accusing the other team uh, of. So, as a closing team, then you can enter the debate and say, unlike our opening team that didn't genuinely acknowledge the best case of the other team or didn't genuinely acknowledge the trade off, that's something that we will be doing. So, knowing these things also forces you to be more realistic with your expectations of what you expect each side to defend. If you're generous with the other side, or if you're humble enough to accept that you need to defend a trade off, it becomes a metric then for you to uh, call out the other teams if they're burden pushing you to defend something that is unreasonable, and say that the trade off that we're willing to accept is this. And we think that the burden pushing that they're giving us is no longer reasonable uh, given the following reasons. So it's much easier for you to defend yourself against teams that are pushing you to defend something that is unreasonable if you yourself have fully acknowledged the extent of the trade-off that you're supposed to defend in the debate. Next one, internalize the rationality why in every tournament there's always going to be a short briefing, uh, up, not only to ensure that everyone is on the same page, or to allow newer debaters and judges to be uh, on board with everyone in terms of our common understanding of the norms and rules and guidelines of the tournament as well as the debating, but also understand that at its core, the reason why you're given these rules is because we want to encourage that an actual debate has to happen. What does this mean? What this means is that the further away you are from having a healthy, balanced debate in the round, short of not having a definitional challenge, the less likely you're going to be rewarded in terms of your speaker scores. That's likely going to result to a messy round. Everyone's going to suffer from it. So the other reason why this is important is because you need to have a degree of mastery of the rules when it comes to debating. The reason why this is important is because it makes it easier for you to call out opening teams when they mess up with the fundamentals. So, say for example, your opening government, say for example, your closing government and your opening government had a difficulty in terms of framing the debate, specifically in terms of how they introduce the problem or how they introduce the status quo in the debate. Now, your ability to understand the basics of the rules and understand what definitions are gives you a better handle in terms of responding to the opening opposition, but at the same time, creating that clarity for the judges and say, the opening teams have defined the debate this way. We will extend by incorporating these elements of the definition that the opening theme have failed to do. Or one of the other things that you can one of the other things that you can uh, think of is when teams accuse each other of, say, being unresponsive. It's very common for teams to say things along the lines of, but they've completely unresponded to this. More often than not, that's a lie, because as even the worst teams would attempt to respond to you. Maybe they would simply not responding. So when teams make disputes, you need to ask yourself, is that really true?
Okay, hello. Sorry, we are experiencing technical difficulties. Please just stay posted. Our speaker is reconnecting right now, so just give us a bit. Thank you. Okay, Rene, just check if you're completely back. Can you hear me?
I'm back. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, great. So again, as I was saying earlier, when any speaker or any team pushes the direction of the debate farther away from having a balance and an actual healthy debate, it becomes your responsibility as an extension team to rein the debate in and bring it back to a place that allows for all the teams to have access to a fair and equitable debate, creating for a more rigorous debating experience. This rewards everyone in general. This ensures that everyone gets the maximum speaker scores possible. And in general, it makes the entire experience more rewarding for everyone. Um, so, next thing that we will be talking about will be the specific things. Uh, Now that you have an insight of some of the things that you need to account for, now that you have an idea what sort of mindset that you need to put yourself into when you're approaching the debate and you draw extension, the things you do during prep time will actually spell the difference between your success and failure. And this is where I'll start to talk about more specific things in terms of strategies, specific questions that you need to be asking. So, one of the things that you need to do is ensure that during the prep time, you ask the right questions. What do I mean by this? Your ability to ask the right question also forces you to think about not only the right answers, but also process the debate in terms of questions that needs to be answered by the end of the debate. So what are important things that you need to ask? So for instance, you can ask burdens. Burdens here can be divided into three things. So you have what we call burdens that are inherent to the motion, meaning uh, something that the motion inherently asks for, regardless of the team, what the motion is asking for that everyone has to discuss by the end of the debate. There's also a burden that is yours exclusive, either as a bench or to your team as a closing team in relation to the motion. So when you're looking at burdens that are exclusive to yours as a bench, then this simply asks, as government or as opposition, what are the things that you're supposed to defend? What are the things that you're supposed to motion? Now, as a closing team, your ability to respond to this is a little trickier because your answer to this question tends to vary based on how the debate is evolving. What does this mean? What this means is that there's a lot of things that can potentially happen in the opening exchange, and you have to adjust accordingly. So your burden may tend to shift depending on what opening teams agree and what opening teams disagree on, what opening opposition, supposing you're closing government, pushes the opening government to defend. It's also possible that you base it on what things they failed to um, account for or fail to factor in the opening debate. You also may want to look at your opponent's burden in relation to the motion. This is again very important because this gives you an idea as to what you should be reasonably expecting your opponents to defend in relation to the motion. The reason why this is important is because unlike simple burden pushing, if you're able to tie these burdens in relation to the motion, it makes it one, less likely to be subjective and less likely to be something that you just want to do because you didn't have anything else to do. But at the same time, it forces you to think about these things in relation to the greater debate that the motion is expecting you to talk about. Um, but at the same time, it's much harder for uh, your opponents to just dismiss it and say that's not important or that's irrelevant because you're able to establish its connection in relation to the motion. So it becomes integral for them to respond to these things, but at the same time, your ability to understand what your inherent burden is. Um, Makes it easier then for you to provide those things and link that to the inherent burden that the motion is asking for. This is also one of those things that I find is underutilized by a lot of teams. Again, the reason behind that is because when teams see motions, sometimes the first thing that they do is they try to associate that based on a motion that they've already seen in the past, a motion that they've either debated, a motion that they've watched. So in the process of doing that, they miss out on important elements in the motion. For example, um, motions that have lengthy info slides because that's a trend now. Sometimes teams would either get too fixated on what's included in the info slide or um not capture the essence of what the motion really is about. So they end up debating things that are tangential to the motion but doesn't really capture the spirit of the motion. So just to give you an example, in a recent tournament that I was judging in, the motion was about regretting the trend of current BL, boys love or yaoi, um, in mainstream media. So one thing that I've noticed teams do is to talk about BL in general and BL portrayal in general. So they would either say that it's regressive because it doesn't represent uh, a wider variety of queer lives, queer experience, queer bodies, queer romance, etc. And then the other team would talk about, well, that's important because this is the only form of representation that we get relative to the wider mainstream barrage of heterosexual romances that we see that is more ubiquitous. Notice that while those arguments are valid on their own, and to some extent, uh, they are things that needs to be accounted for and things that needs to be talked about in relation to that motion, there's a specific nuance that the motion is asking them to talk about, and that is the current representation. So while it's important for you to talk about BL in general, it's also equally important for you to ask yourself, what is BL currently? Because that specific nuance creates a completely different landscape to how you should approach the argumentation of representation. Because while your argument of it being less representative may hold true several years in the past, is that still the same case now? Or when other teams would say, well, this is the kind of representation that we get, how exactly is that? How realistic is that really in relation to other things, especially because if you look at the assessment that GLAD has made, for instance, in terms of the number of transgender characters that have appeared in 2020 in relation to 2019, it's actually increased, and the increase has steadily gone up especially if you look at the last 5 years. So those are important elements that you need to account for. Now, your ability to understand these things also means that it influences the context or contexts that you're operating in. So it's important for you to have an understanding as to what the specific context or contexts are. It also allows you to better define the problem. So oftentimes, when teams do not spend time understanding the motion, when they present the problem, it's a little too generic, or the problem may not be nuanced specific to what the motion was asking for. So if that is the case, as a closing team, you will have a better ability to further define the problem. And say, for instance, if opening teams only talked about the lack of representation, then one of the things that you can talk about is how the lack of representation is very, very critical, especially now. So, what are the things that you can factor in? There's a strong pushback from conservatives, for instance, to police queer bodies and queer media. There's a more aggressive pressure to regulate queer representation. There's a lot of whitewashing, etc. When big companies start coming in and investing on queer stories, they're more likely to dictate the direction of the kind of queer material that will be produced, the kind of queer stories that will be marketed and that will be featured on mainstream media. So these are things that better define what the real problem is, other than the general, oh, we lack representation, or oh, uh, we need this necessarily now because of the lack of representation. So you're a little more specific. It also makes your goal or goals a little more specific, again, because it's more nuanced. And in terms of the principle, it allows you to have a better application of the principle, because it's not going to be a general principle of representation, period, but it's also very important for you to show the real world application of the principle. So if you're better in terms of understanding the nuances of the motion and understand the burdens, not only those that are inherent to the motion, but also specific to your side and to the other side. And if you're a closing team, specific to what is being expected of you at that point in time, given the opening exchange, it makes the application of the principle a little more nuanced. So, for instance, if opening teams already talked about the principle, you will probably be given more points if you're able to apply the principle more specific to the nuance that the motion is asking for. It also allows you to strategize in terms of the scale um, that you want the debate to uh, cover. So what do we mean by scale here? So scale here can refer to macro or micro. So it can be macro in terms of how big you want the debate to be about. So you may want to talk about state, you may want to talk about groups, larger groups of people, you may want to talk about cultures, etc. This is important because your ability to understand the scale in terms of the macro level or the institutional level allows you to understand how these institutions tend to change, if that is something that you want to implement in the debate, because more often than not, debates are about changing something or defending an existing structure. So if you want to push for changing institutions, your ability to understand scale in terms of the institution makes it realistic that one, they may change, but the change is a little more gradual, and the change is the pace of the change is a little slower. So, in terms of the investment in your goals, the goals have to be a little more long term as opposed to those that are short term. And that is the better way to measure the scale in terms of the more macro level. But at the same time, it gives you a better understanding of what we call relative autonomy. What does this mean? There's a degree of freedom that they have in terms of creating these changes, in terms of exercising their degree of decision making, their choices, or in terms of implementing changes on a large scale. But at the same time, that is not absolute in the sense that there are still things that hold them back and uh, hold them into account. So those are things that are very important. Now, another thing that you need to look at in terms of scale is the micro level. And this is where you look at the individual, you look at the family, you look at the immediate community that these individuals have. And oftentimes, when you talk about scale, it's often defined by power dynamics. What does this mean? There's always going to be one entity there that's going to assert and that's going to have more power relative to the other individual. And even in a relationship that's seemingly equal, if you change the context of the relationship that they have, or if you introduce a particular stimulus to that relationship, the power dynamics will eventually change. So it's important for you to consider these things. Apart from that, you also need to look at the choices that these actors or these individuals are that govern the actions that they have, whether it's a rational choice or whether it's a manifestation of an irrational behavior. This falls in the more micro level analysis. So when you're able to identify the inherent burden of the motion, the burden that you're supposed to defend on your side as government or as opposition, and the burden that you're supposed to defend as closing or as extension, one of the things that you can do further to divide the debate is to look at what is the macro level. Analysis that has to be accounted for in this debate. What is the micro level analysis that have to be accounted for? And obviously, if your opening teams talk about the macro level in general, then that gives you the opportunity to talk about the micro level of analysis and really push to prove why that is the more important scale that the debate has to look into. Um, you may also want to look at um, in terms of, like, let's assume that your opening teams talked about the micro level. Does that mean that your default is to immediately go to the macro level? The answer is not necessarily the case, because even within the same scale that they're analyzing, there's still a way for you to integrate yourself into that discussion, especially if that discussion is very contentious, and you know for a fact that when judges evaluate a debate at the end of the round, they will seriously consider that. So one of the things that you can do is, supposing they talk about the individual, you may want to introduce a new actor that is also an individual. So if they talk about, say for instance, again going back to the motion about the trend of BL in mainstream media, one of the things that opening teams are likely to talk about will be the queer community or the LGBTQI movement. One of the things that you can introduce will be to look at how does it affect the families that they have? How does it affect their immediate community? How does it affect themselves as individuals? Or you may want to look at the same group of people, uh, but different spectrum. So, for instance, if they talked about queer people in general, you may want to look at queer people who are less represented. So, say for instance, you want to focus on the trans community or you want to focus on the bisexual community, that adds a layer of analysis that was previously absent in the initial discussion. So, that gives you a better handle in terms of the scale. So, in terms of timelines, uh, this is also one of those things that I feel debaters often do not fully utilize as a unit of analysis in debates, because oftentimes teams are too focused on the status quo, they're too focused on what's happening now, that they forget to realize that oftentimes when it comes to the situation that we have in the status quo, we didn't just wake up one day and that's already the status quo. Obviously, there are several things that happened in the past that led to that particular situation. So, your ability to understand what's happening in the status quo as a byproduct of several things that happened in the past gives you a better analysis compared to the teams that only focused on the status quo. So, for instance, again, going back to the motion about BL representation on mainstream media, because of the emphasis in the word current, it's also worth noting that you need to look back how we arrived at the situation that we are already in right now. So you look at watershed moments, you look at pivotal moments, landmark cases, you look at meaningful changes that happened in the past that led to where we are right now. It's also important in terms of looking at what happens in the future. Again, when teams are too fixated in the present, they often overlook um, what's going to happen in the future. Now, when we talk about the future, there are two ways that you can look at so these are things that are going to be an immediate outcome of the action that you're going to do. So this is where you can see a concrete manifestation of the action that you're going to introduce. So, say, for example, you're going to implement a policy, then your ability to illustrate what the immediate effect of that becomes the short term or midterm outcome. Now, the long term becomes important as well in terms of realizing the goals, because obviously the goals that you want to set for your team are not only goals that are going to be achieved in the short term or the immediate, because if it's that low of a goal that you want to set, you're less likely going to have access to the more lofty, more principled level of goals that everyone wants to have in the debate. So you also want to look at the long term effect. But at the same time, and this is in relation to what I mentioned earlier in terms of the scale, um, long term goals are more likely going to correspond to more macro level and institutional level of changes, because if we want to see changes on that level, the only way for us to do that, or the only way for us to have access to that, is if we're able to see the changes manifest over time, so in a long term timeline. So it's important for you to take note of this. But at the same time, one of the things as well that teams miss out on when they're analyzing debates based on timeline is by looking at the relationship between varying timelines. So teams would either only talk about um, would either only talk about the short term or would only talk about the long term implications of their case, but not in relation to each other. So, one of the questions that you probably want to ask is the short term necessary in order for us to achieve the long term goal? Can the long term goal be achieved even if we fail in the short term goal? Because that might be a necessary sacrifice that you have to absorb in order for you to realize the long term goal. Because there are long term goals that don't necessarily benefit from uh, the short term achievements that we have, because these are things that don't necessarily reveal themselves until we get to the long term ambition that we have. Or if there may be setbacks, these are just reasonable setbacks in the short term, but it doesn't mean that the long term goal um, is affected. Now, all of these things and all of these possible analysis are derived from your ability to understand the motion. So the important note here is you need to understand the motion, the specificity of the motion, the specific contexts and nuances the motion is asking for, the burdens that uh, the motion is asking for. Do not underestimate the power of understanding the motion. So the next thing, um, is to look at the different stakeholders. Now, when you want to look at the stakeholders, you want to look at them as real individuals, real entities that have underlying motivations or incentive structure. What does this mean? What this means is that they don't do whatever they're doing just for the heck of it. More often than not, they're driven by a particular motivation or incentive structure. So it's important for you to understand what their motivation or what their incentive structures are, because the debate will revolve around influencing those incentive structures, either positively or negatively. So it's important for you to have an understanding of those things. Um, it's also important for you to look at stakeholders in terms of their history or backstory. So it's going to establish the kind of character that they are, or the kind of stakeholder that they are. This also gives a better nuance in terms of their motivation and incentive structure. And this does not apply only in debates that requires you to talk about real people, because even in debates, say for instance, IR debates, you can also look at countries in terms of the underlying motivations that they have. So when you look at countries like China or countries like the United States, where there's a clear demonstration of their hegemonic tendencies, one of the things that you can ask is, what is the underlying motivation that they have here? And this is where you can either analyze it from a realist perspective and say that because they understand that they exist in an anarchic situation, anarchic world, anarchic universe, that they have to look after themselves, that all countries are driven by a selfish motivation to survive, etc., then that gives you a better understanding of their motivation. But at the same time, by looking at their history, if one team will say, "Oh, but China is a threat," then you can ask yourself, how threatening really is China, especially when you have people like Duterte, for instance, that say, we are powerless against China when they start waging war against us. So one of the things that you can ask yourselves is, when was the last time China has used its military power against a smaller country? And if you look back in history, it's less likely that you're going to have any evidence of that, if at all. More often than not, they use other means of doing that. So that's going to give you a better and a more nuanced analysis when it comes to the nature of this particular character. You may also want to look at stakeholders in terms of relationships. So there are different types of relationships that you can look at. You can look at internal relationship that they have. So this is human versus the self. So say for instance, if you're debating about the feminist movement as a conservative woman or as a liberal, for instance, what are things that you are potentially going to be conflicted with internally with yourself, um, when you're asked to defend something that don't necessarily correspond to the liberal values or the feminist values that you're expected to live by. So those are very important things. Apart from that, you can also look at the external relationship that they have with their environment or external forces. So this doesn't necessarily just refer to um, nature as in literal nature, but you may also want to look at institutions. So, for instance, if you want to argue about the feminist movement, you want to look at their role and where they are in relation to the institution of patriarchy. Um, you may also want to look at um, the society that they exist in. What kind of society do they belong to? Is it a conservative society? Is it a progressive society, etc.? um, you may also want to look at the relationship of these stakeholders in relation to other stakeholders. So this is where you have human versus human, or in IR debates, this is where you look at states in relation to another state, or state in relation to um, a regional entity. So, an important thing to factor in when it comes to defining and describing your stakeholders is that there are no absolute characterizations. So, if one stakeholder is described to be absolutely evil, the first instinct that you should have is to say that yes, that is true. However, there's a duality to that entity that also makes sure that that this individual has a capacity for goodness as well. This is something, by the way, that I also noticed that teams are so allergic with. When one team is accusing them of a very negative characterization of a stakeholder that they're defending, their first instinct is to reject that characterization and reintroduce a different spin on that characterization. So, say for instance, if you have to defend Kim Kardashian, for example, as a feminist icon, one of your opponent will probably say she's regressive because she encourages a more um, she encourages the male gaze towards women. She legitimizes the sexualization of women and the objectification of women. The normal tendency of teams would be to reject that and say, no, that's not necessarily the case. However, I think it's also equally important to acknowledge that there's a grain of truth to what they're saying. So I think the first strategy for you to do is to say, yes, that may be true, but let's unpack that. What is the extent that, supposing she is going to be viewed by some segments of the society as sexual, that it's going to result to all other women to be implicated by that particular perspective. So the more that you unpack the claims that they have, the more that the more that you're able to contextualize the extent of what they're claiming without necessarily going to the extent of outrightly rejecting their claim. So again, it's important to remember that there are no absolute characterizations. Another thing that you may want to consider is to think about debates as narratives. Think of all the other teams in the debate as PR teams or campaign managers. And oftentimes, when they spin a particular narrative, it privileges a particular stakeholder. So, when they do that, you need to ask yourself what narrative is being privileged, what narrative is silenced or left out, what narrative is subsumed. Is the narrative active, passive, or reactive? And who does the narrative identify as protagonist, antagonist, or side characters? This allows you to identify a specific perspective in the debate. More often than not, with the exception of motions that specifically identify the lens that you need to take the debate in. So, for example, in motions like this House as the United States, so you definitely know that the perspective of the debate has to be looked at from the perspective of the United States. But more often than not, you will have debates that are less specific in terms of the perspective. So, say for instance, uh, motion about this house believes that um, in times of pandemic, nurses shouldn't be allowed to leave their countries, etc. So it doesn't necessarily identify a specific perspective, but your ability to identify the kind of narratives that are being spun by a particular team allows you to identify uh, gaps in terms of the narrative that they have. So, say for instance, if they focus on the nurses, it gives you an idea in terms of the alternative voices or the alternative narratives that are being left out. There are narratives that are being subsumed. They're either going to portray these nurses as the protagonist, the antagonist, or just some side characters that are waiting for things to happen to them, or playing a support role in relation to a larger entity that is operating. Then you get to ask yourself, are they playing an active role? Are they playing a passive role where they just wait for things to happen to them? Or are they a little more reactive? So they're a combination of both. So it's important for you to take note of the perspective, because that gives you a completely different appreciation of what's happening in the debate. So supposing the opening teams view the debate from a particular perspective, just by shifting the perspective a little, you're able to introduce more important nuances in the debate that the opening teams may probably have missed out on. So, now that we know some of the things that you need to consider during prep time, we'll move on to looking at the different types of extension. So, this will just be very quick. There are generally three different types of extensions. So, there's what we call an analysis extension. So, what is an analysis extension? An analysis extension is simply making sense of the debate that has already happened, at least in the opening exchange. This is where your extension will be based on an analysis of what is already happened, where the debate is, what is lacking in terms of what they've argued in the opening exchange, where do you continue from what was already established. The good thing about this kind of extension is that, one, you're unlikely to be considered irrelevant in the debate, because obviously you're cashing in on the debate that is largely discussed by everyone. But at the same time, if you're able to introduce a level of clarity and provide conclusions, break deadlocks, that's going to significantly improve your standing in terms of your ranking in that round. At the same time, the possible drawback of this is that it's likely for judges as well to say that, oh, we didn't feel that your material was exclusive enough, or we didn't feel that you extended enough. In which case, this is where then what I mentioned earlier, you need to be very specific in terms of your assessment of what is happening in the debate. It allows you then um, to properly craft where your vantage point is in terms of the extension that you're going to provide to what was already um, provided. So when it comes to employing analysis extensions, you need to make sure that you are as specific as possible, that you are as clear as possible, that you guide the judges as smoothly as possible. So you need to be very explicit in terms of the signposting that you're going to make. So if you're going to say this is the deadlock that that we've seen from the opening exchange, the reason why this deadlock exists is because of A, B, C, D, E. I will resolve this deadlock by firstly admitting that it may be true as accused by our opponent, but even if that were true, this is the analysis that I will be providing. But I will also deconstruct this by proving to you that the harm they asked us to defend is not as big of a problem as they claim it to be. So when you introduce this kind of analysis, or this kind of extension, um, you need to think of those things. The next one is introducing a completely new extension. So this is something that nobody has talked about in the debate thus far. This is where you can be very creative. You think outside of the box and completely flip the debate, look at a different perspective, introduce a different stakeholder, provide a different understanding of the problem. You can introduce a new principle, etc. So the danger of doing this is you run the risk of having to defend the relevance of this extension that you have. Because if you think about what it demands in order for this extension to stand out relative to what was already established by the opening themes, you need to assess the level of um, debating that already happened in the opening exchange, and you need to overshadow the extent of debating that happened in the opening theme. So if the opening themes that you have are pretty good, then you need to not only just do good for the new extension to make sense, you need to do better than that. So that's the drawback when you want to launch a completely new extension. You need to assert its relevance, not only on its own, but also in relation to what was already provided by the opening team. So it's important for you to think about that. Um, the good thing about this, though, is um, you're not going to have as much difficulty convincing the judges that what you're giving is something that is unique to your side. So that's a good thing. The last type of extension that we will be talking about is what we call the hybrid extension. So this is a combination of the analysis extension and a a completely new extension. So when it comes to running hybrid extensions, this is where you just need to assess, and this is where you just need to weigh in where the debate is at this point in time, and ask yourself, is it going to be more strategic for me to provide an extension that is completely new, or is the debate requiring me to analyze more what was already provided by the opening themes? So if the analysis if after assessing the opening debate, and you feel that there needs to be more analysis, the new extension or new material that you have to introduce in the debate, then the composition of your hybrid extension will be, say, for example, 60% analysis extension and then 40% new extension. So the composition of your hybrid extension depends on what the debate is calling for at that point in time. Um, so these are the three general types of extensions that you have. The other thing, when it comes to extending and the difficulty of it, is what we call the paradox of being in the closing team, because there essentially are four teams that are competing in a British parliamentary debate. And as closing teams, you have to compete with your opening team, but at the same time, you have to remain consistent with your opening team. So, this is where a lot of teams get accused of knifing their opening teams. I'm seeing a trend of teams becoming bolder and being required to be more explicit about this one. You just need to ensure that there is that degree of balance when it comes to fulfilling your role as a closing team. That being, you're able to craft distinction and carve out a unique extension for yourself, but at the same time ensuring that fundamentally you are still consistent with your opening teams. So whenever you are choosing to craft that exclusive point between your team and your opening team, you need to think about these two things that you need to fulfill simultaneously as a closing team. So do not get carried away and just completely go with your opening themes. You need to ensure that you draw the line between their team and your team, but at the same time, um, also illustrate that you are consistent with them to some extent. So now that we have covered the different types of extension and things that you're supposed to consider as a closing theme relative to your opening theme, how then do you extend? So for me, and as I've mentioned from the beginning of this lecture, uh, this speaking position is not too restrictive and it's not too rigid in terms of its structure and in terms of what it's expecting you to talk about. However, you can't just talk about whatever you feel like talking about without any rhyme or reason. There needs to be basic elements that have to be included in your member speeches. So the first one is you need to introduce the second half of the debate. And this is where your strategy has to come in. So this is where you need to have an assessment what has happened in the debate thus far. Where do you come in? How do you come in? What are things that you're going to highlight? What are things that you're going to deprioritize? How do you make sense of what already happened in the opening themes? How do you distinguish yourself from your opening theme? So this is where a lot of the strategizing has to come in, because again, this is where you introduce the second half of the debate, and this has to be very clear to the judges. The next part of or the next content of your speech has to be a response to the previous speaker and the opening half. So sometimes you can mesh these two things and just directly respond to the opening as a whole and just specifically point your responses to a particular speaker if necessary, or if there are elements in their speech that um, they have not accounted for that does not fit in your overall assessment of the opening exchange, then you can focus on the speaker first and then proceed to the opening half. And lastly, in order for your speeches to be considered an exclusive extension, you need to add something meaningful. uh, Take note that when I say add something meaningful, I didn't define it as constructive, because oftentimes people assume that extensions are only valid when it's a constructive material. But that's not necessarily the case. A responsive material or a rebuttal can also add more meaning into the debate and add more meaning to the discourse, and is therefore should be considered as a legitimate extension. So again, these are the three elements that should be present in your member speeches. How you want to execute them is completely up to you, but you need to have all these three elements. Again, you need to strategize how you're going to introduce the second half of the debate, highlighting your side in relation to your opening themes, respond to the previous speaker and the opening half in general, and add something that is meaningful to the existing discourse. So that concludes the lecture that we have when it comes to extensions. Like what I've said, this is not in any means the most exhaustive and end all be all discussion when it comes to members, but hopefully I was able to give you something new, something that you can think about, something that affirms what you already know, or something that either challenges what you think you already know, or something that encourages you to experiment a little more when it comes to how you craft your extension speeches. So now that I'm done with the lecture, we will be proceeding to um, the questions, if there are any.
Yep. Okay, so I can send one right now. When you're at CO, how would you determine if it is worth it to run a risky or creative extension that significantly reframes the debate? And if so, how can you do this without getting boxed out?
Okay. One of the things that I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture is to take note of some of the most stellar speeches that you've heard, and all of them have a distinct characteristic to them, and that is that sense of deliberateness. So, if you want to run a completely unique material at closing opposition, there needs to be a good reason why you wanted to do that. You need to have a good explanation to yourself first and foremost when you're prepping and in the middle of the round, why you need to insist on running that material. In the lack of a solid answer other than, oh, but we just need to run a completely new material, then probably it's not going to be worth it, because chances are you're running a unique extension for the sake of it, not necessarily because that's what the debate calls for at that point in time. So that's the first one. Second, I think it's important for you to do that, but consider where the debate is at that point in time. And this is where I was saying earlier on, you need to feel the rhythm of the debate, understand how the debate is progressing, leading to your extension speech. Now, if at that point in time you feel that the debate is calling for more resolution, that it requires you to make sense of the debate more, then maybe you can deprioritize insisting on a completely new line of extension, but make sense of the debate first. And then after that, you can run your exclusive and unique perspective. That way, you remain relevant in the larger debate. So, in response to your question, how do you not get boxed out? That's how you do it. You need to make sure that you claim relevance to the debate, that's to the larger debate that most of the teams have already established, but at the same time, create a link to the new and exclusive material that you wanted to run. The next thing is, in order for you to not be boxed out, one, you need to respond to teams that call you out and say you have to be boxed out, or teams that attempt to box you out. So you need to push back and say why the material that you have, as much as it is unique, and why while they may consider it as a completely boxed out argument, it is the most important one. That's the first. Second, assuming none of the teams explicitly box you out, but it's the judges that thinks that you are going to be boxed out, I think it requires that you facilitate the thinking process for the judges and show them the logical reasoning why you decided to run that particular extension. That way, the judges have a better understanding of how you logically came up with that extension. That way, judges will not consider you as completely boxed out because they understand the rhyme and reason behind that particular extension. So, those are the three things that I think you need to consider. Again, uh, the first of which is, um, ensure that you have an understanding, solid understanding why you want to run that extension. And if you can't find any, then perhaps it's not worth it. The second one is, and I think the most important one, feel what's happening in the debate, read the debate, analyze the debate, understand the debate, and ask yourself, does it really call for a completely new perspective at this point in time? If the answer is yes, because essentially the existing debate has pretty much been settled, then go ahead and do that. But acknowledge first the larger debate that has already happened prior. Or if based on your analysis, what the debate calls for at that point in time is more resolution, more making sense of what was already established, then I think what you can do is delay that material a little later. So you need to first engage the existing debate that has already happened, and then run your exclusive material. Or if you can be a little more crafty and find a way to run your completely unique extension and find a way to incorporate the larger debate that has already been established, then that's going to make your extension stand out all the more. The last thing, as I've mentioned, is you need to facilitate the thinking process for the judges by allowing them to have an insight into the thought process that was involved in the delivery of that particular material. That way, um, your judges will not box you out. I hope that answers your question. Do we have other questions?
Yep, let's just wait for the questions to file in. So you can go drink
Okay.
water or something first.
Okay, sure.
Okay, Rene, here's another one. How do we credit contributions that aren't explicitly new constructive arguments? For example, responses or framing.
Okay. I'll try to answer this by looking at it from two perspectives of two different actors in the debate. The first one is from the perspective of a judge. How do you credit these things? One of the things that judges are so scared of doing is being accused of stepping in. However, the way that you can credit these things, even if they're not explicit, is to simply ask yourselves, are these things present? Are these things manifested in the speeches of the speakers? If they are, then you can just identify what those things are. So, say for instance, if one team succeeded in reframing the debate, or one team succeeded in responding, even if it wasn't explicit. So, say for example, they didn't explicitly say this argument is in, or this rebuttal is in response to the point that was given previously, but their entire case was a response to it. uh, then as a judge, it is your responsibility to give credit to that. Not because you're stepping in, but because the material was there. So if teams will ask, but that wasn't explicit, or you were stepping in, then the response that you can give to them is that the material was there. So as a judge, I'm not only going to base the debate based on what was explicitly said, but I'm also going to analyze what are the implications of the things that you're saying in relation to your claims, in relation to the case of the other team, in relation to the larger debate. So you need to actively think about, uh, you need to employ some level of analysis as well as a judge. Now, as a debater, say for example, you're the whip and your extension um, was a little more implicit and wasn't explicit, then I think what you can do is to guide the judges and say that what is the underlying um, value of the contribution that my teammate has provided. So what you can do is verbalize it explicitly if you're the teammate of that particular person. But if you're also not going to do that, what I think you can do is highlight the importance of it without explicitly saying that this is a response or this is a reframing. Uh, that way, when it comes to the judge's appreciation of it, they'll see a clearer understanding of why these things are important. The other thing that you can do is you can um, ask judges to get to a point of reasonability. What do I mean by this? If it's not explicit, one of the things that you can guide judges in terms of analyzing the content of your case is to say that this may not be explicit, but if you infer what the intention of this argument is, you know for a fact that this is what it's leading to. So if that's the case, then you're able to facilitate the thinking process for the judges so that they will see um, what the intention or what the value of that contribution it is without it being explicit. So just to wrap the answer to this question up, um, it's best if you always try to be explicit. That way, you leave little room for other teams to misconstrue you or to accuse you of not having an actual contribution. But supposing you weren't as explicit, it's not the death of you as judges. You have the responsibility to actively process the idea and not just based on things that are being said, but actually think about uh, and analyze the cases if the material is there or if it can reasonably be inferred based on the material that was there. So you don't just draw out something that wasn't there. There has to be a basis to it. Um, and if you are the succeeding speaker to an extension speaker or a member that wasn't as explicit, then you can be explicit. Or if you're unable to do that, then do the proper highlighting or walk the judges through the thought process. That way, it's much easier for them to see the value of the contribution without it being explicit there.
Okay. Let's wait until 9:25 for
Okay.
the last few questions to trickle in.
Okay, sure.
Okay, we have another one. Um, as a member, how do you best maximize or utilize prep time with your partner?
Okay. I think you just the first thing that you need to do, as I've introduced in the presentation that I had earlier, you need to make sure that you pin down your understanding of the motion and not just ensuring that you understood the motion literally, but to understand burdens, understand the different stakeholders, understand the um, inherent burden of the motion, the burden of the motion in relation to your team, the burden of the motion in relation to your entire bench, what the scope or scale of the debate is. I think what you can do is prep as if you are the opening teams and then make an assessment whether or not the things that you have covered thus far are intuitive or not. So if they're more intuitive, then be more open to the possibility of them being taken by the opening teams because obviously they are intuitive. If they're less intuitive, then uh, those are exclusive material that you can hold on to and probably launch a little later. Um, so at that point in time, you just need to make sure that you cover all the intuitive things, the basic things that are expected based on the motion itself. That way, when the debate starts evolving, you can use that as a benchmark to adjust the material that you have prepped with your teammate. So, in conclusion, the way that you would best utilize your prep time with your partner is to prep as if you're the opening team, and then use that as a benchmark to adjust the material later on. However, there are times when you debate with people that you are familiar with. So, for instance, if I debate with certain people, I know how these individuals usually strategize. I have an idea as to the way that they craft their speeches, the way they craft their opening speeches. So if that's the case, I already have an idea what sort of material they will not be covering. So that way I can focus on building those things. And during the debate, I can just draw out links between their contribution and my contribution, or I can find better justification as to why my exclusive contribution is the more valuable contribution based on things that they're lacking in the opening teams or things that they're missing. Thirdly, you can also look at who the judges are. So, based on who the judges are, sometimes judges have preferences in terms of what resonates to their judge values more. So you can also factor that in when you prep and ask yourself, what do they usually look for? So you can start investing your time on those things. So those are the three things I think that can help you utilize your prep time better with your partner if you are an extension speaker.
All right, we can begin the closing. Thank you so much. So, thank you for the great lecture, Rene. We really enjoyed you teaching about the discipline required to approach closing debates. We hope those important lessons are absorbed by our union's present and future members. So, with that, allow me to share screen here. Um, we present to you the Certificate of Appreciation on behalf of PDU. Thank you so much for devoting your time and your effort to helping us spread debate education to our union. So, to close things, a few reminders: the stream will be edited and uploaded to the YouTube channel, PDU Workshop. Subscribe there and see all of the previous ones and all of the future workshops that we will be holding. Keep an eye out for our administrative segment. Aside from that, follow our page for more updates on whatever future things the union is up to. And we wish everybody tomorrow good luck for everyone competing in the Malaysia ABP 2020. Um, Aside from that, Rene, would you have any last words for all of the people watching our stream?
Um, this is not debate related, but for all of you who are of legal age, if you haven't registered as voters, please make sure that you register and make sure that you vote come election. I think there's a lot of fixing our democracy that our democracy needs, and we have to reclaim that power. So, for all of you that have not registered, please do register and make sure that you vote this coming election. So, that's not debate related, but I think that's important.
All right. Thank you so much, Rene. See you guys next time. Thank you.
Thank you.